Anthony Davies, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's get to the economy. That's what they always say that it's the economy, stupid, is when it comes to
Right.
how things are going to pan out, what people care about. I think just even around the world with different types of governments, we always say, oh, we want democracy to spread or we want this or, but people seem to care more about whether or not they can live a good life more than anything. It is the number one thing in anybody's mind. Um, Recently, I have to bring this part up. I want to get into this. Recently, on your Words and Numbers podcast, you talked about the middle class. And one of the main talking points in politics is the shrinking middle class. The shrinking middle class. Bringing it up all the time. We got to do something about the shrinking middle class. But you say, yes, there's a shrinking middle class, but it's not a bad thing. Can we
No, it's a
talk
really
about
good
that?
thing.
It's a
Yeah.
good thing. Why is it a good thing? Kind of
Well,
explain this to us.
what happens is when politicians talk about the shrinking middle class, the unspoken implication is the middle class is shrinking because we're migrating into poverty.
Yeah.
But if you look at the numbers, and Census Bureau makes these things available on a regular basis, so too the Congressional Budget Office. If you look at the numbers over time, what you find is that the middle class is shrinking. Adjusted for inflation, back in the 1970s, over 50% of us were in the middle class.
Hmm.
Today, it's much less, and I forget the number off the top of my head, but I believe it's somewhere around 35 to 38%. So it's a dramatic shrinking of the middle class. But if you look at the poor classes, same thing. They're shrinking as well. And what's happening is we're moving into the rich classes, which today, and I'm going by census numbers, today they're counting it as anybody $100,000, any household $100,000 or up. And depending on where you live, $100,000 doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, this is aggregate for the whole country.
Hmm.
So those rich classes are growing, and that's adjusted for inflation. So this is in real purchasing power terms. And I think people tend not to be aware of it because whenever something new or good comes along, it kind of very quickly becomes part of the normal. And
Hmm.
it's no longer this thing. There's a comedian who has this skit about he's on the plane, he gets Wi-Fi and how cool it is, and then it goes down, and now he's mad about it, and how quickly something goes from this is really neat, it's a new thing that I have, to this just should be here all the time. And we tend to
Hmm.
treat so many things like that. We lose sight of the fact that we've become incredibly rich. And so when I say things like the rich classes are growing, people kind of look at me strangely.
Do you think that so I can understand that we're becoming wealthier. It seems like we're as a whole becoming wealthier. That's what you're seeing in the numbers, right? That the middle class is
Yes.
becoming wealthy, the poor class is becoming middle. But we're feeling extremely strapped for cash though. I mean, we're seeing well, I guess the first question I would have is what are they basing the numbers on? Like if they're saying, okay, you're not poor anymore, are they using the same, let's say, number since the 70s? And in the 70s,
Mhm.
it was if you made $25,000, you were middle class. And now if and maybe that was middle class in 1970, but now today they're still using the $25,000 mark, right? And they're saying, oh, you're
Right.
you're middle class. Like, is that what's
Yeah, no,
happening?
no. No, it's adjusted for inflation. So
Okay.
when I say, for example, any household from 100,000 up is considered in the rich classes, in 1970 the number wouldn't be 100,000, but whatever that number is, it's the equivalent to what today we call 100,000.
Okay.
So in terms
So it
of
is
real purchasing
adjusted for
power,
inflation because we've had
yeah,
quite a bit of
right.
inflation over like especially recently.
Mhm. hmm Yeah, it's
Okay.
adjusted for inflation. And I think one of the things that happens, and you can see this in your own behavior, I don't mean you specifically, but people in general can see this in their own behavior. When you get a new job or you get a raise or something, your income goes up. What happens? Your spending goes up to match it. And at the end, you're as strapped for cash further down the road as you were earlier. What's happened is you've just expanded your spending. And so people will say things like, well, today's young people can't afford a house like their grandparents could. Well, the thing is, they could afford a house like their grandparents could. They don't want a house like their grandparents had. Houses
Hmm.
today are larger, they have central air conditioning, they have internet, Wi-Fi built in, all this stuff. You didn't have that in houses 2, 3 generations ago. And so we have this sense that if we can't if we can't have ever more year after year after year, somehow we become poor.
Hmm. Well, but I mean, if it is relative, because it would be like, yes, we're a wealthier country. We don't really compare ourselves, for example, to Nicaragua, right? We don't say, well, I mean, obviously their middle class is much different than our middle class. Their middle class might look like our poor.
Well, yeah, and actually that's true not just for Nicaragua, it's true for the world. You take 7.25 an hour job in this country, which I don't think anybody's going to argue. That's a poverty wage, clearly,
Yeah.
7.25 an hour. 7.25 an hour, full time, you're earning gross around $15,000. Now, take into account differences in costs of living across countries. It's cheaper
Yeah.
to live in Mexico than it is to live in the US, and adjust that 15,000 for differences in costs of living. And what you find is that thing we call poverty in the US is actually middle class for the rest of the world.
Hmm. So I mean, I could see that we are certainly living larger than our grandparents. When I look at even where my grandparents lived, the home they bought after World War II, the home that they raised us all in, their kids and the grandkids, people buying, I mean, a house that size, I should say. I was about to say, well, people living in that neighborhood today, but that neighborhood is like a historic neighborhood now, so it's
Right,
really
right,
expensive.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
but equivalent in size, if you take it out of the fact that it's now a historic $1 million neighborhood because people are crazy wanting to buy those old houses. Um, you put that in, right? That is a much smaller house than, I mean, that would be somebody that's considered poor living in a house that size today.
right,
A tiny
yeah,
little house, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, 7 kids living in
hmm
that tiny little thing is
yes,
not something that, today we would never even fathom that. We wouldn't fathom having 7 kids. But if we did, we wouldn't shove them in a 2 bedroom, 1 bathroom house with a basement and and saying, okay, well, a bunch of you are going to sleep in the basement,
yeah,
right?
and
That
that
would be
was
poor,
usual. That was middle
right? That
class
was
a couple of
normal.
generations ago. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we want more. We're buying more, and and so that's why you're saying that we're not actually as bad off as we say we are. We're just kind of doing a keeping up with the Joneses attitude.
Yeah, we are. And this is one of the strange things that if you've got something better, maybe it's a bigger house or it's a nicer car or it's a boat or whatever it is, you feel rich having that unless everybody has it. If everybody has it, all of a sudden you don't feel rich anymore. And I think that's where we are as Americans. Of course, there are exceptions, but largely speaking, we have become very rich, all of us.
Yeah,
And so we look around and we think, well, this isn't rich. I'm not rich. And the problem is we're surrounded by rich people. We complain in this country about the 1%. In a lot of ways, America is a nation populated almost entirely by one percenters when you think
yeah,
about 1% in the global sense.
right, right. The amount of wealth here compared to like
Right.
Nicaragua, other places.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And you talk about housing. A good thing to talk about is medical care because we complain again in this country about the price of medical care. And it's absolutely right, the price of medical care is astounding. However, in a lot of ways, it's lower than what it was in the 1950s. And how do I know this? Because in the 1950s, people would routinely die of things that today you can walk into a pharmacy and get an over-the-counter cure for. You can go, you talk about 6, 7 figures to get a heart transplant. In 1950, that was science fiction. Infinite dollars wouldn't buy you a heart transplant. Today, you could get it merely for 6 figures.
yeah.
That's astounding improvement.
So then what do you think the problem is? I mean, do you think that I mean, are we brainwashed? Are we living too high on the hog? Like, I mean, what
No,
is it?
I think in part it goes back to this idea that we're taught as children, our grandparents and parents teach us this, and we tend to forget it, to be thankful for what you have. And I'm not saying that, you just be satisfied with everything, but you have something that's good, be thankful, look at it and say, this is a really cool thing I have here, rather than taking it for granted. And I think what's happened over time, we as a nation, we become richer in a slow sense, 3%, 4% a year, and you tend to not notice it. but you do
Mhm.
that 3 to 4% year after year, generation after generation, and all of a sudden you're in a situation where we're incredibly wealthy and we're unaware of it because it happens so slowly over time.
I think one of the problems was the boomer generation. And let me
How
explain.
come?
Well, because the generation, the World War II generation, what do they call them? What is
Right, the
what is
boomers.
no
Or yeah,
the
no, the
before
greatest
then.
generation.
The
Yeah, the greatest
greatest
generation.
generation. Yeah,
Yeah.
the greatest generation. Wow, who named themselves that? So the greatest generation, they lived, when they bought a home, like my grandparents, for example, my
Mm,
husband's grandparents, for example, they bought a home. It was almost their first home. Maybe it was their second home after being married and coming back from the war, but it was pretty early on, right at the very beginning of making their family, if they even had a kid at all. Okay,
right.
for both grandparent sets, who are now 90, 95 years old, by the way. But um, they still live in that house. I mean, they owned that one house until the
Mm,
day they died. They didn't upgrade. The boomer generation, though, had a different way of going about things. I mean, I was raised by a boomer. We switched houses. We upgraded houses. We started off in one home, and then I got to my teenage years and dad was doing better. So we moved into a bigger house, and then dad was doing better by the time I got, and then moved into a bigger house. And there was that upgrading that happened in that generation, whereas the greatest generation didn't do that. And so I
right.
think then the subsequent generations, like mine and younger, in particular, well, probably like Generation X and some millennials that are raised by boomers, saw our parents upgrading constantly, able to get the bigger. You have a starter home. I don't know if that was a thing with the greatest generation. If they had
Mm,
starter homes, they just had a house. Like I said, my grandparents had a 2 bedroom, 1 bathroom house with a basement, and they had that forever until the day they died. And they
right.
bought that thing for like $8,000,
Right.
back.
Yeah.
And so maybe it was the boomers that kind of created this buy more, buy bigger, upgrade your houses. And now the new generations, the younger generations now are not able to do that. They're not able to upgrade houses without moving into an entirely new city.
Yeah, and I think there's something interesting there because you said earlier when you referred to your grandparents, having 7 kids in a 2 bedroom house. And so when the boomers came along, they were wealthier than the greatest generation, and so they could afford to upgrade. And so what did they do? They no longer had to have 7 kids in 2 bedrooms. Every
Yeah,
kid could have his own room, or maybe you have 2 kids sharing or something like that.
sure.
And then when the next generation, Generation X, comes along, they kind of start at that level, right? I mean, I've had a bunch of kids in we had them maybe two to a room, maybe one had one room, but we had six, so it was a lot, right? But the
Right.
thing
Yeah.
is, we start, each subsequent generation starts at that next level. And so I can look back at my parents and say, well, they went from house to house to house, getting bigger and bigger and bigger when I didn't. Yeah, except I started 2/3 the way along of where they were. In other words,
Hmm.
at age 25, I had a house that was equivalent to what my parents had at age 50.
But do you think it's because costs have gone up? So now generations are not able to upgrade. What I'm seeing now amongst my friends and slightly younger is that they buy a house and they realize unless they want to switch cities, they're going to have to live in that house like the greatest generation did forever. They're going to raise their family in that house. They're going to retire in that house. They're going to die in that house. Because right now, like for example, in Los Angeles, if you bought a house 10 years ago, I mean, now it's worth way more money. The inflation has gone so high that if you want to upgrade your home, you either have had to have a significant windfall of money suddenly, like more than just your average raise every year working a regular job. You'd have had to have a significant increase in order to stay even remotely in the same area and upgrade your home. Something that the boomers were able to do. They would just go down the street and get a bigger house. Now, you'd have to literally, pack up and move your kids, switch schools, switch your whole life, move far away. And so a lot of people are just not doing that anymore. Is that because of, I mean, what do you think why is there that inability anymore to be able to do that? Is that because of rapid inflation in the cities? Is it because our wages are not increasing at the same rate that boomers wages increased and they were able to do that? Is it that
Well,
they just lived in a different era and houses that the cost difference wasn't as high? Like, what do you think?
well, you used a word. You said how is it that they can't do this? And I'm not sure that can't is the right word. Now, maybe in markets like specific markets like Los Angeles or Manhattan, can't is probably the exact right word. But in most of the country, I would say the right word isn't can't, but rather doesn't. That is, we choose to spend our money on other things. Yes, I'd like a larger house.
Mhm.
We say those words, but if you look at our behavior, what do? We put a large chunk of money into retirement, which earlier generations tended not to do. We buy a better car, a bigger car, multiple cars, which earlier generations tended not to do. We go on vacations, which earlier generations tended not to do. We spend our money in other ways. And so, in some sense, a lot of us, while we say we can't afford the larger house, what we really mean is we can't afford it given all of these things I'm already spending my money on, but we forget that our parents didn't spend their money on that stuff, in part
Yeah.
because that stuff didn't exist.
Right, but okay, so I can see where some of this for sure I understand, but I mean certainly we're not all crazy. I mean we do feel like things have just skyrocketed in price. I mean childcare has gotten enormously outrageous. Education, if you put your kid in a private school or if you go to going to college, I mean these things have gone. Are we just insane, or have
Yeah,
these
no, no,
things
no,
actually?
not insane at all. But I think what you're bumping up against is an observation bias, and that is we are very attuned to things that are expensive because things that are expensive are painful, and so they're top of mind, and we notice these things. Things that become cheaper, we tend not to pay attention to. And so when we look around, we see all the expensive stuff, not seeing the other things that have become cheaper. Case in point is gas. Now we complain about the price of gas, but if you calculate number of dollars it takes to buy enough gas to drive a mile, gas today is significantly cheaper than it was in the 1960s. But we tend not to notice this thing. Air travel, for example. Air travel, when I was a kid, was basically first class. That is,
Right.
if you couldn't afford a first class ticket, you couldn't afford to get in the plane at all, right?
Yeah.
And now you can, travel. I'm going to Phoenix tomorrow. I think the round trip ticket was like $300 or
Yeah.
something ridiculous, right? And so we tend to see the things that are more expensive, not see the things that are less expensive. That's not to say that the more expensive things aren't there. Yeah, of course, education costs more, healthcare costs more, but then there are these other things on the other side. So when you put it all together, our lives on the whole end up being a lot better than the lives of our parents and grandparents.